There seem to me to be basically three types of Back to the Future fans, or just three types of people actually, now that I think about it. Because who isn't a Back to the Future fan is just such an awesome film. I honestly can't fault it, it's my all-time favourite film. But basically, I find that there are those that only like the first film and just don't care for the other two for some reason. And then there are people who like the trilogy as a whole but think that the second film is the weakest. And then there are those, probably like me, who like the trilogy as a whole but think the third is the weakest. But that's not to say I don't dislike. I like this film. I should probably say I don't dislike this film. It's a double negative. I do like this film. There are sort of aspects about it that sort of make me sort of almost have to like it in many ways, because it does serve the trilogy quite well. There's a lot of things that are set up in the second film that are paid off basically in the third film. In hindsight, I actually think Zemeckis and Gale actually made a mistake by setting things up in the second film to pay them off in the third, because you're basically sort of banking on your audience going to see the third after they've seen the second. It makes the second film, maybe as a film on its own, not look as good. But by comparison, I think actually this film looks much better as a film on its own, because it is its own story. It is very unique in that sense. It's a much more sort of original kind of idea than maybe the second film is. And for a long time, that was actually what I didn't like about it. It's very much the black sheep of the franchise. It feels much more like a western. There isn't nearly as much of a focus on time travel. I think maybe what you need to try and do is just look at it as a film on its own, because that's where it works. The second film doesn't really work as a film on its own. It does sort of more work as a sequel to Back to the Future. This one isn't really a sequel to Back to the Future. It's just a good film on its own, I think. We get more of a focus on Doc. Kind of a role reversal almost, actually, with Marty now being more the voice of reason as opposed to Doc being the voice of reason in the first film. And you do get a lot of sort of interesting parallels with the first film in that sense. You've obviously the most obvious one is where Marty and Doc switch catchphrases at one point, with Marty saying "Great Scott" and Doc saying "This is heavy." But there's also another parallel with the first film, which is when Clara comes into the Doc's warehouse, or wherever it is that he lives in 1885, and they have to cover up the DeLorean, and the Doc's rather spitten when she comes in. That's a sort of parallel of when Lorraine comes into the Doc's house in 1955 in the first film, and Marty's kind of sort of smitten by Lorraine. It's an interesting dilemma that the Doc is faced with in this film, which is does he go back to his own time, and do what logically makes sense as far as he as a scientist is concerned, or does he follow his heart and stay with Clara? He says right before he meets Clara, actually, in this film, it's not worth the risk of falling in love or getting a girlfriend in 1885. It could disrupt the space-time continuum. And even after he meets Clara, he's sort of horrified to find that he's altered history by saving her life. The Doc, at his heart, is very much a scientist, and yet it's a testament really to how much he cares for Clara that he's maybe willing to overlook this and stay with her, for however long it was, that he had those two boys that we see at the end, and is willing to make that sacrifice, which I guess doesn't affect the space-time continuum in any kind of major way, because nothing seems to happen. And then, of course, you have the payoff with Marty, finding out that he doesn't need to just prove to everyone he isn't chicken. Like I said, that's kind of a risk that Zemeckis and Gale took with that story arc, which comes over from the second film, which for some reason is never addressed in the first film. I guess they weren't planning to make a sequel when they made the first film. Kind of a risk, but it kind of works and kind of doesn't, because it makes it more difficult at the same time for you to look at either of the two films as films on their own. With the second film, I don't think that's such a bad thing, because the second film does feel much more like a sequel to Back to the Future, whereas the third film is much more a film on its own, and perhaps these tie-ins with the other films are a little off-putting. These parallels with the first film, I think, perhaps are a little off-putting as well. You kind of sort of want to look at this as more of a film on its own. And that's, I think, what puts a lot of Back to the Future fans off, and they don't want to see this kind of thing. They want more of a focus on time travel, and for a long time that was definitely what put me off this film. At the same time, I kind of felt like I just sort of had to accept it, because without it, it's not the Back to the Future trilogy. Without it, a lot of things in Part 2 don't make sense. But there are definitely some aspects to this film which make it work on its own. I'm willing to appreciate that. Certainly the visuals in this film are much better than I think I can ever recall seeing in either of the other two films. You get kind of a slow opening, I think, to this film with, just the Martian 1955 doc just going about... at the time looks like it's going to be a film of only like about 20 minutes or something, because it looks like it's just going to be Marty going back to 1885 and destroying the time machine, and then they make that discovery with the grave. And the whole time that first act's going on, you're like thinking, well, where is the film here? What's going to happen exactly? I mean, I suppose you would kind of know if you'd seen the trailers where exactly this film was going, but if you hadn't seen the trailers, you might be kind of wondering, well, why is this a film? It's just Marty going back to 1985. What's so exciting about this? There are other parts, though, that kind of make me want to see sort of maybe, not so much a sequel, but maybe more of a sort of expanded universe type material. I mean, there are probably fan fictions out there that cover this. What happened to the 1955 doc after Marty left for 1885? What was the doc doing for those first 8 months in 1885? Part of me actually sort of wonders what happened in the alternate timelines where the doc is shot as well. Because you see the doc get a gun in his back at that sort of party or dance thing where he meets Buford Tannen, and then they have a little bit of a back and forth, and he dances with Clara and everything, and then eventually Tannen decides to shoot him in the head, and the only reason he isn't able to do this in the timeline that we see in the film is because Marty throws a frisbee at him, and it knocks the arm he's holding the gun in and they'd established earlier they only had one bullet, so that was enough to save the doc. But the gravestone clearly stated that the doc was shot in the back, so I don't quite follow that. What happened in the original timeline where the doc is shot? Did the doc not protest like the way we see in the film or something? Also, he's still stated as having his beloved Clara on the gravestone, and we see in the film that he only met her a couple of days before he got shot, so that's... fell in love pretty quick, obviously. I suppose there's the classic sort of time paradox thing that you see with pretty much all time travel stories, which is if Marty goes back and saves the doc from being shot in 1885, there's no gravestone for him to discover in 1955, so he wouldn't go back to 1885 because he only went back to 1885 because he discovered the gravestone. But, that's kind of sort of time travel logic that you just see in films constantly, and there really is just no way to avoid that kind of plot hole and paradox kind of thing. Even in films like Back to the Future, where they do sort of do their best to try and avoid those kinds of things. It's in the first film as well, if Marty prevents his own existence by preventing his parents from meeting. How could he have gone back to 1955 to stop his parents from meeting? What else? Obviously, the sort of addition of the character Clara, kind of irritating at the same. I have kind of this difficult kind of dilemma with love factors in films. This certainly does seem a bit out of place for a Back to the Future film, which is why I sort of insist on looking at this as just a film on its own merit and not trying to look at it as a Back to the Future film. My reaction to love factors in films can be like either end of the spectrum. It can either be, oh yeah, go for it, man, this is great, such great chemistry between these two characters, you're just loving every minute of it, every time, one of the characters makes a bit of progress with them, it's sort of all the more satisfying. I'm actually sort of getting that a little bit sort of vibe from Spike and Rarity in My Little Pony, actually. Just because the progress that the two of them are making and the way that their relationship is evolving, because it's being done over a number of episodes, it's very slow, and it's very sort of tantalising and teasing the audience, and it's kind of satisfying when we get just little bits here and there. Obviously in a film you can't really do that. You have to have it sort of be completely developed over the, 2 hours of film. So it's naturally going to seem a bit sort of rushed and like they've fallen in love sort of instantly. And it's the same kind of thing here, Doc and Clara, they seem to sort of just fall in love like instantly. And, I know, love at first sight, it's a kind of sort of cliche type thing. And, it's all supposed to be sort of, oh, they're so much in love, they fell in love, at first sight. It doesn't seem very... buyable to me. It doesn't seem very realistic that kind of thing would really happen. But, you see that kind of thing in films constantly. There is the other kind of love factor in films that I see constantly, where the two characters, I either just don't care about them or they annoy me. So, if they introduce some kind of love factor involving a character that annoys me, or even two characters that annoy me, it's only going to annoy me even more, because it just gives this character or characters more screen time, which I'm not interested in. In the case of this film, of course, I obviously I like Doc, how can you not like Doc? Doc's a great character and everything. Clara kind of annoys me, to be honest, so it's kind of a sort of 6 of one and half a dozen the other, this love factor, as far as I'm concerned. I kind of feel sort of like personally satisfied for Doc that, he's getting this development, for one thing, Obviously it's just great that we've got a bit more of a focus on him here. I kind of would have liked the actual person he fell in love with to be a bit more interesting, really, rather than just, this woman who's interested in science, to be honest. I could tell that Zemeckis and Gale sort of just went for this woman that was interested in science, was essentially just a female equivalent of the Doc, 1885 female equivalent of the Doc. It's an okay love factor, but it's not one of the best I've ever seen in a film, to be honest. It's certainly not the most enjoyable aspect of the film. The dilemma about the possibility of him having to abandon Clara, that's pretty interesting, but that's only like in the last third, I think, so overall the love factor only half works, I think. We do get a great climax, I think. In fact, we sort of get two great climaxes in this film. We have the sort of good, the bad and the ugly sort of parody of Marty and Buford Tannen facing off, and Marty, rather than just doing the sort of cliched thing of shooting Tannen, Marty does the sort of more noble thing of not actually killing him, but instead sort of using his ingenuity to outsmart him, and that's pretty cool, that's pretty clever. I honestly did not see that coming the first time I saw this film. And then obviously you have a similar kind of climax to the first film, which is with the DeLorean and having to push it up to this barrier and getting up to 88 miles per hour. It's all about, can they, rectify the situation in time. In the first film it was getting those wires connected, in this one it's rescuing Clara. I've got to be honest though, watching this climax just recently though, I have to sort of question what originally the plan was, to get the Doc on board the DeLorean, because basically what happens is the Doc's riding the train, and then once, the DeLorean starts to speed up, he says, okay, I'm coming aboard. Eventually he never does get aboard the DeLorean, because he has to go back for Clara, which was obviously not part of the original plan. So I just sort of have to wonder what was the original plan to get the Doc on board the DeLorean, because we never really see that come about. He sort of stops halfway, There was this sort of barrier he had to cross between the train and the DeLorean. I didn't quite understand how exactly he was planning to cross that exactly. Kind of a flawed plan, but maybe that's just a sort of nitpick. The actual climax overall was great, and obviously the climax to what is basically the trilogy, once they arrive back in 1985, is obviously great as well. We see the Doc has a family. We see that Marty's future has been fixed. He's not just suckering into whenever anyone calls him a chicken anymore. So it does round off the trilogy very nicely. It gives us a somewhat satisfying story. It gives us more of a focus on Doc. The villain, Mad Dog Tannen, is not as interesting as Biff. He's a very different kind of character from Biff. He's a much darker, much more sort of brutal kind of character. He's not as enjoyable on screen as Biff was. And he's also, I noticed, actually not given as much screen time either. I guess Zemeckis and Gale sort of realised he wasn't as interesting a character as Biff, maybe, so they decided not to give him as much screen time. He's an enjoyable enough sort of jerkish, dark kind of character that, is basically just there for Marty to sort of realise, I shouldn't just have to go out there and have a shootout with this guy just because he's telling me to. He's also probably not as clever as Biff, actually. In fact, there's a moment in the film, actually, where he doesn't understand what forfeit means, and then he's counting to 10, and one of his gang have to tell him what number comes next. Overall, yeah, it probably is the weakest of the trilogy, I would say. The love factor only sort of works. The climax is good. The story doesn't really feel like a Back to the Future story. The villain isn't as interesting to watch. There's an interesting conflict, and there is an interesting focus on Doc, but it's not as gripping as the first two films, I wouldn't say. So yeah, overall I would say that it is the weakest of the trilogy, but that's not to say it isn't a good film. As a film on its own, I think it's fantastic, though. It just isn't really a Back to the Future film. I don't think that's kind of the sort of catch-22 dilemma I've always had with this film. Okay, well, that is Back to the Future 3. It is a film I would recommend, but just try not to think of it as a Back to the Future film. Okay, see you later, guys.